AM 1160. He is Senator Joe Pittman in the studio with us this morning as we talk a little bit about what's going on in Harrisburg with the opening of the winter session, I guess, for want of a better term. Good morning.
We call it the spring session.
Is that what you
Good
call
morning,
it?
Todd.
See, you're looking ahead. You're forward-looking people.
We are indeed.
Conversation brought to you by Marcus and Mack, a law firm representing injured people. So some things happening early in 2022, and I feel compelled to start with the Reggie conversation because we've heard, as I said to Jim Struzzi a couple of weeks ago, we've heard that early 2022 is that's when the bell rings, and it appears that it's on the verge.
It continues. The regulation is not into effect, and it will not be in effect until we continue our review process, which now includes our opportunity to override his veto of the disapproval resolution. Mm-hmm. And we have 10 legislative days to consider that, which gets us into early April before it could even be considered to be published, as they call it. After that, we will end up in court if there is no agreement or resolution. I remain convinced that there are pathways forward in a bipartisan way to do positive things when it comes to the environment. But we have yet to have an engagement from the governor or to get us together in a bipartisan way to figure something out. And so we'll continue to fight this. It's bad policy. It doesn't make sense for the Commonwealth. I think that's been proven over the last 2.5 years that we have debated this regulation.
The pros who watch this say that there's not enough votes for an override, and whether or not that comes up for an override vote, I guess, depends upon whether you can change some minds.
Well, the pros didn't think the Steelers were going to win the Super Bowl back in 2006.
Good point.
I'm not into prognostication. We'll leave that to Punksy Phil. All I know is we've had strong bipartisan support for both the disapproval resolution and the legislation that Representative Struzzi and I have had that actually did have veto-proof margins, which simply said the General Assembly has the final say on whether or not we enter into Reggie.
All right. So that Reggie conversation will go on. We'll continue to be very interested observers of what happens there. Meanwhile, we talk about the typical things that we talk about in January, and that includes an upcoming budget address from the governor and the opening of those talks.
Yes, and I will say we are in very good fiscal shape right now in terms of revenue surplus. We are at about $1.3 billion ahead of estimate in terms of what we anticipated our budget to have this time last year. And so that's a positive. I'm always very concerned, particularly in this segment where we're having hyperinflation, whether or not that's going to last. And, state government is not immune to inflationary impacts. Mm-hmm. And so we have to be very diligent about that. But right now we are in pretty good shape. And what we're seeing revenues up across all lines, everything from income to sales to inheritance tax, what we call the sin taxes, cigarettes and gaming. And so it's up across the board. And, we have to be very conscious, though, that we have some real obligations out there, namely in the pensions. One of the areas that I think has been under the radar that we've not paid much attention to is our unemployment compensation fund. We have a lot of concern in terms of its stability after what we've gone through with the pandemic and the spike in unemployment claims.
Yeah, all that being the case, there are some people who are going to say you've got surpluses and it's time to start spreading that money around. Certainly, there are agencies very much deserving of increases in funding. We know that, but does inflation and the effect that it is having on our economy across the board, does that maybe put the brakes a little bit or at least make you a little more cautious?
Well, we have to recognize we have a labor force of tens of thousands of people who are Commonwealth employees. The private sector right now is seeing wage rates increase significantly. Mm-hmm. And so we're not immune to losing quality people within our workforce. And in fact, if you talk to PennDOT, they're very nervous about finding enough truck drivers to maintain the roads here in the winter. CDL drivers are in very high demand. And so you do have to think about what it's going to take to remain competitive in our marketplace to keep our employees, particularly for those critical services like CDL truck drivers. It's not like you just hop in a truck and start plowing snow.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that takes training and it takes skill, and those skills are in demand in the private sector. So we do have to be very careful about that.
Yeah. The state system of higher education
Mm-hmm.
is always a very, very, it's a pivotal point with the budget discussions. The governor will respond, of course, with his budget address. The legislature, of course, will then weigh in. The state system is asking for a very big increase in spending this year, and we watched the state system redesign and how it's working. I know that's very concerning to you. What is the prognostication? Maybe that's not it. Where does state system funding stand for you as you deal with this big request?
Well, for me, I consider it to be a very high priority. To me, it's not the question of making the investment, it's how is the investment used. And what I don't want to see is a continued drive to putting dollars into these integrated universities to prop them up at the expense of IUP. And so the state system is asking not only for $75 million in recurring support, but also $50 million for redesign. And I don't think redesign is about 6 integrated schools. Redesign should be about the entire system. And there are fundamental issues that not only IUP, but all of the system schools face, particularly as it relates to student housing and the cost of student housing on campus. We're not unique in that we have more beds than we need. The cost of housing on campus is extremely high. It's a barrier to entry. And I think that those types of things need to be looked at when we talk about using these dollars to make it more affordable for people to come in to IUP or another state system school to receive their education.
Those, for want of a better term, dormitories, the residence halls, when they were built, there were concerns issued about, as nice as they are, they have to be competitive with other universities, so they made them as nice as they possibly could. But at the same time, they said they were pricing them themselves out of the market, and that seems to have been the case not only here but at other schools.
Well, and I think what's compounding that is the capacity. If I recall correctly, when these residence halls were redone, beds were not added on campus. Now, beds have been added off campus, but there were not additional beds put on campus. It was a drive to make a higher quality product and more attractive to students. You're absolutely right. But as enrollment has gone down, the pressures of continuing to maintain them, particularly the debt service, increase. You know, I liken it to empty seats on an airplane. You know, when you're flying an airplane and you have half the seats empty, it doesn't do you any good to keep them empty. And so I think that's part of the spiral that we have here. But yeah, I mean, student housing overall in our community is a concern of mine. We have many more beds than we have students. And that's not a healthy thing for a community. And I think you'll see, in fact, one of the announcements we made about a month ago alludes to it. We need to right size the overall housing footprint in our community, particularly as it relates to student housing.
Yeah. Okay. So that's going to be something to watch here in the spring as well, is the state system of higher education. What is it for you that are your priority items for these next 5 or 6 months?
Well, you hit on two of them. The system obviously is a high priority. The issue of bringing Reggie to conclusion is a very high priority. I think we have to look at our transportation infrastructure. I do think the surplus gives us an opportunity to finally properly fund the state police through our general fund and stop draining our gas tax revenue when it should go to the roads and bridges that we need so desperately to repair. So I think that's an opportunity. I think that should be a priority in the budget upcoming. And then the most immediate issue we have is the redistricting process for both congressional and legislative. They're, as we've discussed before, two very different tracks, but they're both going to come to a head very soon.
We saw yesterday in Ohio that the redistricting there was turned away by a judge who said it was gerrymandering. I don't know if it was legislative or congressional there, but the courts have become very assertive, haven't they, in the redistricting process?
You know, it depends on the state. I think I saw where North Carolina upheld the maps drawn there, their state court, did, and they basically said, look, we have no business in this process. This is a process left to the legislature and the executive. So, courts are like anything else. The people that are elected or appointed have a point of view, and when they are in those positions, they have the ability to express that as law. From our vantage point, what gives me hope, particularly on the legislative reapportionment seats, is that the fifth member, Chairman Nordenberg, was appointed by our state Supreme Court. And so I would hope that any maps that he finds his way to supporting would be looked favorably on by the court, because after all, he is essentially their proxy.
Your district, of course, shifts with the latest map that has been proposed, whereas you add to the north, and the Butler County portion of your district goes away, but then you get a good chunk of Jefferson County.
Well, and Westmoreland County. So what will happen, keep in mind, every Senate seat has to have approximately 260,000 people. And that leads to me having to add at least 20,000 people in the current district I represent. Mm-hmm. And so as your lines shift and you lose people, you have to pick them up elsewhere. So basically, I'm going to, if this map is approved, represent Punxsutawney, the Punxsutawney School District, which I thought makes a lot of sense because it splits counties. And so it's a common community. Mm-hmm. All of Indiana County, all of Armstrong County, and then I essentially run northern Westmoreland County. I run the borders of southern Indiana and Armstrong County to pick up Ligonier, Derry, Vandergrift, Lower Borough, New Kensington, Arnold. Mm-hmm. So it's a big area, but if you look at a map, it makes sense. It's compact, it's contiguous. I think it recognizes common communities, and most importantly, it provides the equal population requirement that we all have. But it's a bigger territory. It's going to be an adjustment, and it's a reality of our population shifts over the last 30 or 40 years here in western Pennsylvania.
Senator Joe Pittman with us here this morning. Final moment of our conversation. Back in Harrisburg next week?
Yes.
In Harrisburg next week.
Yes.
Anything big on the agenda that you're aware of?
Reapportionment, the congressional process, which is a distinctly separate process. The House passed a map. Mm-hmm. It now comes to us, and we have to try to reconcile any differences with not only the House, but most significantly the governor. And then we'll be preparing for budget negotiations, budget hearings. I'm on the Appropriations Committee, so those will begin as soon as the budget address is delivered in early February.
Feels like we've been in park for a while. We're about to put it back in drive. Senator, thank you.
I drive, yes.
It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS, 101.1 FM and AM 1160. Fox News is up next, and then Josh Widdison in our WCCS newsroom.
101.1 FM and AM 1160 WCCS, Homer City.